When you hear the word Kansas, what do you think? Flyover country? That's what a lot of people think. That's certainly what I thought some years ago. And there were many times that my wife and I would fly across Kansas. And I'm sure Kansas was down there somewhere at 35,000 feet. But there have been a couple of times that we've had to drive through Kansas. And in 2012, I gained a new appreciation for Kansas. You see, our daughter moved out to Colorado, and we had all of her stuff here in Pennsylvania. And so we had to rent a U-Haul and drive across the country a little over 1,800 miles to Colorado Springs, where she was just moving into an apartment out there. And so Kansas was on the way. There was no avoiding Kansas. So I remembered that some college friends of ours had recently moved to Kansas, and turns out that they had moved to Topeka. And Topeka was on the way. It's right on I-70. So we called them and asked if we could stay overnight, and they said, no, we're actually out of town in Chicago visiting our daughter. And we said, well, we'll be coming back through Kansas a week or so later. Will you be there then? And they said, yes, and we'd love to see you. So we planned that. Well, we got to Topeka and stayed overnight in a motel. And when we got to the motel, I said to my wife, I said, you know, I seem to remember that wacko pastor, Fred Phelps, and the Westboro Baptist Church, that's in Kansas. It's either Topeka or Wichita. Well, I went on the internet, looked it up, turned out it was Topeka. And I said, this is an opportunity. Because I said, you know, this wacko goes all over the country demonstrating at funerals for service people and all these other churches. And I said, that is just so opposite of what we're about in our family, in my denomination, the United Methodist Church, where our slogan is open hearts, open minds, open doors. And so I said, I got an idea. I said, let's first find out where the church is, and then let's go to the dollar store and we'll get some poster board and I'll make a poster. So we did that. And then we drive a few miles east in Topeka, and the church wasn't that far away. And so we're kind of cruising around the block with our U-Haul in tow and everything. And it's the craziest looking church I've ever seen. It looks more like a fortress than a church. There are big warning signs all over the place, cameras that are pointed down the street and sidewalk. And I said, you know, this is kind of a scary place. And then there are big banners. And the banner that day said, Fags Doom Nations. Okay, that was the big banner that was across the top of the church. So I got out my poster board on which I had drawn a huge heart that said, God loves everyone. And I stood in just the right place so she could get that sign behind me, and she took a picture with that poster. And it was the biggest hit on Facebook that I've ever had, I have to say. So that was kind of a lot of fun. Then the next day we kept going, and we came to Russell, Kansas. And I remember that Russell, Kansas is the place where Arlen Specter grew up, as well as Bob Dole, two senators that ran for president in 1996 against Bill Clinton. Neither of them won, of course. But I thought, isn't this fascinating? This tiny little town in the middle of nowhere, Kansas, 4,500 people. We need gas, so we pulled into this convenience store. There was a man there who was emptying the trash cans, and he said, wow, you're from Pennsylvania. He said, I grew up on the eastern shore of Maryland. And he started talking to me, and I said, how did you end up in Russell, Kansas? Well, he told me that he and his sister wanted to be able to buy a home, and the only place that they could afford to buy a home was in a place like Kansas, and he looked it up on the internet, and they ended up buying a home for $4,000. He said, $4,000? And he said, yeah, it's a pretty big home, too. And he said, I had to do all this rewiring and replumbing and everything, but he said it's really worth it. Well, the guy was fascinating, and if it had not been 105 degrees with a 30-mile-an-hour wind, I probably would have talked to him a little longer, but my wife was getting a little antsy because Colorado was still a distance away. So we got to Colorado. Well, as we were driving west through Kansas, suddenly we saw all of these huge windmills, wind generators, and that was fascinating because the last time we'd been through Kansas, I hadn't seen any of that, and we saw these trains going through the prairie, and in Kansas you can see for a long way, and these trains were carrying the big blades for these wind generators, and Kansas turned out to be a pretty fascinating place, but 10 years, exactly 10 years before that, Kansas didn't seem very interesting to us. We were just returning from a trip out to the Four Corners area. We'd seen all the great national parks out there. We were coming back, and we got to Colorado, and we're driving through Colorado. We got to the edge of Kansas at 9 o'clock at night. We stopped for dinner and had far too much to eat. And my wife had this great idea. Why don't we just drive through the night? Because we have 3 licensed drivers now in our family. We'll just all take turns driving through the night. That way we don't have to see how boring Kansas is. Well, I started driving, and Kansas is very flat and very straight, the roads. And I drove, and I said, "Does anybody want to drive?" And they were all asleep in the back seat. And I drove a couple more out. Anybody back there want to? No, nobody wanted to drive. They were all asleep. And at 3 in the morning, I'd had enough. So we pulled off at Salina, Kansas. And I had always heard that you could go into a Walmart and you could camp in the parking lot, which is fine if you have an RV, but we didn't have an RV. We had a pop-up camper that we were pulling behind us. I have never seen a pop-up camper set up in a Walmart parking lot. But that night at 3 in the morning, we all groggily got out of the car and set up the camper. And it's just an amazing experience when you get up the next morning and walk out of your camper in your pajamas and the whole world is coming and going around you. And it was an interesting experience, one that I would never do again for sure, because it was pretty hot in that camper that night. But it's just a reminder to all of us. You know, it seemed like a good idea at the time to drive through Kansas because we thought that it was going to be boring. And when you think something is going to be boring and uninteresting, it will be. But if you're looking for adventure, you can find it anywhere, even in Kansas. Thank you.